Anthony, welcome to the show. So good to have you here. This is such an important topic for Catholics. And so I'm excited to dive in. What I've kind of observed anecdotally when it comes to young people whose parents are divorced, maybe seeking an annulment, is that there's a lot of confusion around this annulment process, around what an annulment is, what it's not. And so I'm hopeful that we can kind of shed light on it to answer, some questions. Because some young people will wonder, it's like, man, if my parents get an annulment, does that make me illegitimate? Does it mean my family is kind of erased? Does my parents, marriage essentially cease to exist? Lots of questions, lots of confusion. So I'm really excited to dive into that. Before we get to those questions, just for everyone listening, you are an expert in this area. You have a lot of expertise here. And so if you would, tell us a little bit about your job as the judge and director of the tribunal in Denver.
Yes, thank you. I'm the director of the Metropolitan Tribunal of Denver. Before this, I was in Colorado Springs. I worked in the tribunal as an auditor and a judge. I began working in 2007 for the church, for the tribunal. 18 years of experience, something like that now. So I have a bachelor's degree in philosophy, I have a master's in theology, and then a license in canon law. So I've held several different positions in the church and the tribunal throughout the years, from auditor to advocate to notary, assessor, and now judge, and now in Denver as the director of the tribunal.
Okay, very good. And to anyone listening who's like, what's a tribunal? Maybe could we talk a little bit about church law and tribunals?
Yeah. The tribunal is the kind of judicial branch of the church. If you think of the church as sort of like the government, you have the executive branch, the legislative branch, and the judicial branch. Now, in the United States, those are separate powers, right? Not one person holds all these, but they're separated between various groups. In the church, however, it's the bishop who holds all three powers. So the bishop is the executive power, the bishop is the legislative power, and the bishop is the judicial power. The judicial system exists to resolve disputes. St. Paul gets on the Corinthians case because they're taking their disputes within the church and they're going to civil courts and civil judges. And St. Paul gets on their case and says, why are you doing this? Why are you taking your cases to the unbaptized when you should bring them to the church? So there was a very early tradition in the church of court, of the bishop holding court and hearing cases. One of the primary ways that that's done today is through annulments. So there would be Catholics or anyone who's interested in maybe marrying a Catholic, and they want to dispute their marriage. It looks like a marriage on the surface, but now they bring a petition to the tribunal, the Catholic tribunal, and say what appeared to be a marriage really was not a marriage for some concrete reason.
Okay. And thank you for clarifying that. And that's fascinating about kind of the structure of the church being under the bishop. It makes a lot of sense. So you kind of went into it already, but I'm curious, to anyone wondering again, what is an annulment exactly? Do you mind explaining that?
We think of marriage as a relationship, right? But it's deeper than just a relationship. It's built on a relation. Now, what is a relation? A relation is an ontological kind of category. You have a relation between your father and your mother, right? So father, son, there's a relation there. Mother, son, or mother, daughter, there's a relation there. And then on the basis of that relation of father, son, you can build a relationship. Okay, and so I think we see this with father and son. It's very clear that there's a level that's the relationship level, and then there's a level that's the relation level. Even if your relationship with your father completely falls apart and you profess you hate each other and you never talk to each other again, the relationship may have died, but the relation is still there. You're still the son of your father. Your father is still your father, right? No matter what what happens to the relationship. The same is true with marriage. So when you show up to church and you pronounce the vows, you give your consent for marriage, that establishes this relation of now husband and wife. And hopefully on that is built a relationship, hopefully a very good, loving relationship. But the church teaches is even if that relationship goes south and dies and they hate each other and don't want to talk to each other anymore, there's still that relation. They're still related as husband and wife. And that ultimately comes from Scripture. Jesus taught this. He said multiple times in the Gospels that if you marry and then divorce and remarry, you're committing adultery. And so the church has, over the centuries, reflected upon that and said, okay, well, that means that when you get married, there's this ontological relation that happens. And no matter what happens in the relationship, you're still going to be husband and wife, even if the relationship dies. So what is an annulment? An annulment is kind of looping around after the fact, after the relationship has died, and examining that relation, that husband-wife relation, and asking, was there anything that interfered with that at the time of the wedding? Is there anything that got in the way so that this relation between husband and wife really never came to fruition? That these were just two people that lived together, that had a relationship together, that built a life together, and then that relationship died. So that's what the annulment process is about, is again going back and looking at that more ontological level, the level of the relation of husband and wife.
Okay, that makes sense. And for anyone maybe unfamiliar with the term ontological, what's a rough definition of that?
It has to do with being, kind of a way of being. So this is more than just a job, right? You could be a plumber, and that's just your job, your function. But I'm talking about a deeper kind of level of being, where it's like I'm a husband kind of before anything else. So that's kind of the deepest aspect of my being, is as a husband, as a son, things like that. And then you can build on top of that relationships. And
okay, that makes sense. So it's kind of that layer of identity, and especially the deepest identities that we hold and ways of being. That makes a lot of sense. So from what I hear you saying, the annulment process, which we're going to get into in a second here, is not a Catholic divorce. Sometimes there's confusion around that.
Yeah, so the church has a long history of opposing civil divorce. Again, going right back to the words of Jesus. Jesus said if you're married and then you divorce and then you remarry, you're committing adultery. And the logic there is that divorce really doesn't do anything. Divorce is essentially meaningless. Divorce does not affect that relation of husband and wife. What divorce does is says that the relationship has come to an end. That for whatever reason we can't live together under the same roof, we can't make this relationship work. And so we're going to put an end to this relationship. We're going to stop living together. We're going to maybe stop sharing finances or whatnot. But the church has always taught that that does not do anything to affect that relation of husband and wife. So even though the state proclaims that it dissolves a marriage with a divorce, that you're no longer husband and wife, the church says that's essentially a fiction. The state has no power to dissolve a marriage, to make a husband and a wife no longer be a husband and a wife. So the annulment process is looking at that deeper level. It's looping back around after that divorce, after the relationship has come to an end, and really asking those questions about what happened at the church, what happened when we were giving our consent. Were we capable of that? Were we thinking the right things? That kind of thing.
Okay. No, that makes sense. And it's so fascinating what you said about the church's history in kind of opposing civil divorce. I'd like to talk about that a little bit more. So it is fascinating when you read the gospel that Jesus was very stern. I don't know, maybe there's a better word to say about this, saying that in the beginning, this thing, divorce, it was not so. And Moses basically allowed it because of the hardness of the hearts. I'm paraphrasing. But talk about that a little bit. So this is something like Jesus, I remember hearing Dr. Scott Hahn say, the church has kind of tried to soften in some ways what Jesus said, but has had a hard time doing that. So talk to me about this history.
Yeah, it's a bit of a hard teaching. But it's a hard teaching, I guess, in light of our own weaknesses, right? The original plan was that a man and a woman, they find each other and they become one. And that becoming one, no one can undo that. That's the reality of marriage and what marriage is. But because of our own hardness of our hearts, because of our own sinfulness, because of our own bad behaviors and whatnot, many times it's difficult, if not impossible, to maintain that kind of relationship. The church has really struggled with this, I have to admit. The Jews were struggling with this. Jesus pointed out that in the beginning it was man and woman for life, one union that no one can separate. But because of the hardness of their hearts, divorce became a reality. It's not the ideal reality, right? But it is the reality even of our own world. Divorce is kind of everywhere. Nevertheless, the church holds marriage as a sacrament. Marriage truly is a reflection of the relationship between Jesus Christ and the church. And just as God became man, he took on human flesh, he wedded himself to humanity in an irreversible way. God is never going to wake up tomorrow and say, well, I'm just done with the human race. I can't take it anymore, right? Let's file for divorce.
I hope not.
He probably wants to sometimes, but God is faithful. God is true, right? And so he's, despite our own sinfulness, despite our own weaknesses, he's never going to leave us. He's never, ever going to abandon us. And so marriage is supposed to be that sign and symbol of this relationship that we have with God, with Jesus Christ. This indissoluble relationship that no matter what we do, God is going to be faithful to that. And that's what marriage should be a reflection of. Marriage doesn't mean there's going to be no hard times. There may be hard times. There may be adultery. There may be infidelity within marriage. And these are extremely difficult things to deal with. But if you think, well, what would Jesus do? Jesus did do this. He wedded himself to us, to humanity, and we decided we hated him for that, and we nailed him to a cross. And even though we did these horrible things to him, he still loves us and still remains faithful to us. So there's a beautiful calling there. Spouses are called to be that faithful example of Jesus Christ. So if your spouse falls into adultery, again, this is extremely difficult to deal with, and there's probably lots of therapy and things that need to happen. But the Christian is called to be like Jesus and to forgive and to find a way to reconcile that. So that's the ideal. That's what Scripture holds out as that's what marriage is.
Yeah, no, and I love, people are probably thinking, well, what about this case and that case? And we can get into all that because I think there's so much wisdom in how the church does, holds the standard high and doesn't falter on the principle. But of course, there needs to be prudence given particular situations. So like the case of infidelity that you said, it's like, well, if the fidelity is ongoing and unrepented, that's one situation. But there's a different situation if the infidelity was like repented and ceases.
Yeah,
that's kind of another situation. So I know there's kind of like all these fine details, and even reading the very little canon law that I have read, there's even very specific instructions for like what to do in different situations, even though it does require like human interpretation.
Yeah. And, like you said, there's so many different situations. You could be in a situation of abuse where, one spouse is being abusive towards the other. And in those situations, I think it's for the safety of the one being abused to separate themselves from that situation. You have to take care of yourself both physically, mentally, and spiritually. And you can't allow someone to abuse you or beat you up or whatever. So there's times that it's necessary to separate yourself, to seek a separation or possibly a divorce. Anytime a Catholic, though, gets a divorce, you have to have the churches thinking about divorce. Divorce doesn't really mean anything other than a separation. We're still husband and wife. We still have those obligations, even if we're not living under the same roof, even if we can't communicate in a healthy way together. So Catholics, can get a divorce, but they need to be thinking about it in the right way. The divorce is not the end of a relationship. It's maybe the changing of a relationship. But ultimately, we're still husband and wife.
That makes so much sense. It is fascinating to read the Catechism and to see how it seems to talk about divorce in like two senses, like you said. In one sense, it could be used as this legal maneuver in order to protect a spouse and or children.
Right. In
another sense, when used incorrectly, a divorce can be used as kind of like an exit plan to go seek my own quote unquote happiness.
Right.
Am I right in understanding it in that way?
Yeah, I think so. Catholics just, you have to be careful that you don't fall into that secular mentality of, well, marriage is just too hard for me. I'm giving up on it. I'm going to go find my happiness somewhere else. To some degree that's legitimate, but you just always have to remember if you married this person, you're still married to them, even if you're not living under the same roof, even if you're separated, even if you're divorced.
That makes sense. And that being said, there is a reason for the annulment process. Like there are legitimate cases, even if our culture and like our secular way of thinking maybe veers so far from what God originally intended, there is a purpose to it. And so I'm wondering at a high level, how does the process work? Like if someone, is like, I think my marriage wasn't valid, or we can get into all that. What are the steps at a high level? Yeah,
at a high level, I think the first step is always meet with your parish priest. Your pastor can help direct you, figure out, usually there's someone called an advocate who helps someone who's in need of a declaration of nullity, helps them kind of maneuver the process, fill out all the paperwork, but most importantly, make an argument. Really, that's what we need someone to do, is to make an argument that my marriage wasn't valid for these reasons. And most people, this is kind of beyond them a little bit. So we have advocates who can help people do this. It depends, every diocese is different. Sometimes the pastor is the advocate. Sometimes it's the associate pastor or the deacon who's the advocate. Sometimes there's a lay person who's an advocate. Depending on the diocese, maybe they don't even use advocates, but maybe you need to contact the tribunal and talk to someone there to get the ball rolling. So depending on what diocese you're in, what parish, where you're at in the country, that can look different. The initial stage of reaching out to someone in the tribunal can look very different. But I would say it's always a good idea, just go talk to your pastor. Your pastor will have good advice for you on where to go and how to get this thing started. But essentially, it's contacting the tribunal and getting a bunch of paperwork and filling out a bunch of paperwork and then submitting it to the tribunal. But beyond the paperwork and the bureaucracy, you're approaching the church, you're approaching really the bishop. This is the bishop's judicial power to decide these cases. And you're asking for a judgment. You're asking that what appears to be a marriage, what appeared to be a marriage to everyone, that the church overturn that presumption and declare that the marriage, even though it looked like a marriage on the surface, really was not a marriage at all. And that always requires some sort of evidence or proof. So you have to both articulate a specific reason in canon law and then prove that or provide evidence for that. Evidence is always or usually going to be witnesses. You could have documents that could be proof, like if there was some sort of maybe psychological disorder, maybe someone was diagnosed as bipolar or something. If you have those records, medical records, that could be evidence. If you entered into the marriage with a prenuptial agreement, that entering into the marriage with a prenuptial agreement itself is highly problematic. It seems like you are likely excluding the indissolubility of marriage because you're planning for an eventual divorce. So that prenuptial agreement could be a document that you submit to the tribunal as part of the proof. But most often, proof is going to be witnesses. So when you're looking for an annulment, you need to be asking yourself, who could be a witness for me? The best witnesses tend to be people who really know you and your former spouse and know why you wanted to get married and problems within the marriage, all that kind of information. People who work best as witnesses are parents, siblings, close friends, people that you have shared intimate details about your life with. So it's necessary to kind of bring these elements forward with you when you petition the church.
Okay, so then you petition the church, and then from there, and I know we're kind of maybe speaking more to the parents at this point, or maybe someone who would go through, but I think it's helpful for all the children who are listening to this knowing like, okay, this is what mom or dad would go through if they did go through this. My mom and dad are actually going through this process right now for context for everyone. And so then after that, I'm curious what happens next at a high level.
Yeah, so you submit a petition to the tribunal. The tribunal would then look at everything and accept the case if it seems like it has merit to it. So you would probably submit written statements, kind of the story of your marriage in writing, kind of a narrative of that. The tribunal may wish to also interview you, to ask other questions, to elicit information. They will always reach out to your ex. And there's a reason for this. This is a marriage between the two of you. If you're arguing that the marriage was invalid, your ex at least has the right to be informed of this, if not to fully participate and tell his side of the story or her side of the story. So we always need a good address to send paperwork to your ex. Now, they don't have to agree or be cooperative at all. There's a lot of fear sometimes that once I submit all of this, can my ex just derail the process or make it so that I don't get my declaration of nullity? And the answer there is no, they can't really do anything to stop the process. But they can participate in the process. And we always want to hear both sides of the story. If we're only hearing from one party, we understand that we're hearing kind of a lopsided story at that point. So it's always beneficial to hear two sides of the story. So we will always reach out to the ex and elicit their participation. Again, it really varies. Sometimes they never respond to us. Sometimes they call and yell at us for hours. Sometimes they throw it in the trash. Sometimes they want to be very involved and name their own witnesses and provide their own testimony. So the options are open.
Yeah, no, I bet you see a lot, and I'm excited to keep going through this. But I'm curious, some young people have told me that maybe there's been times where, especially I'm thinking of a situation where I think it was a daughter, young adult who was a devout Catholic. The parents, I think, weren't so much, but there was some reason they still wanted to seek the annulment. Okay. And if I remember right, she was kind of concerned that they were going about it for the wrong reasons. And so I know it's a big question, but I'm curious, like, what's maybe the proper like attitude or approach when it comes to seeking an annulment so that we don't, again, fall into the secular mindset of like, this is kind of my escape hatch. So you just found out that your parents are getting divorced, or maybe the pain from their split has started to resurface. Either way, you feel alone, and you might even be experiencing emotional problems like anxiety, falling into habits that you're not proud of just to numb the pain, and struggling in or feeling afraid of romantic relationships. I've been there. I totally get it. But worst of all, perhaps you fear that one day you might repeat your parents' story. If you can relate, I wrote a free digital guide for you. It's called 7 Ways to Work Through the Pain of Your Parents' Divorce. Inside, I share practical steps that you can take to grieve the loss of your family, healthy ways to deal with your pain, and expert tips to heal those wounds. It's what I wish someone would have told me years ago, seasoned by 20 years of experience navigating my parents' split, listening to hundreds of young people from broken families one-on-one, and helping tens of thousands of us heal and grow. You are not alone, and you're not doomed to repeat your parents' story. Download your free guide at restoredministry.com/7 ways or click the link in the show notes.
Right. And unfortunately, many Catholics approach it like that. Like, well, this is just the thing I need to do so that I can get remarried in the church. But the best mindset to approach this with is discernment of, I don't know for sure, but I think my marriage is invalid. Here's my argument. And I'm submitting to the judgment of the church. I really want to hear what the church has to say about my marriage, because that will determine what's possible for me. So many people come to the tribunal with a second marriage already planned, or many times it's already happened civilly, and now they want to just get married in the church. Or they already have someone, a fiancé in the wings, and they want to get married, as soon as possible. And that's just the reality that people approach the tribunal. But again, the best mentality, though, would be to approach the tribunal even before you have someone in mind. Really, it should be, can I even be allowed to date? Because right now I'm married, right? I'm separated and divorced from my spouse, but I'm still married to that person. I still have to be faithful to that person. Sex outside of marriage is still a mortal sin. So in discerning how God might be calling you to move forward in your life, part of that discernment is the annulment process. Submit to the judgment of the church, put forward your best argument, put forward your best evidence, but then just wait to hear back from the church whether they declare your marriage invalid or not. If they declare your marriage invalid, that means you were never really married, and now you would be free to marry. Or you were never really married, and now you would be free to join the seminary or join religious life. Whereas if they say no, if they give a negative decision, and the church says we can't declare your marriage invalid, well, then that determines what's possible for me in my life moving forward. If that's the case, if I'm validly married to my spouse, I just can't live with her or him, we can't be in the same room together without fighting. Well, you need to learn to live that way then. You need to live faithful to your marriage vows. That means, no romantic partners other than your spouse who you're divorced from. No going on dates, no living with someone else. But there's a real path to holiness there. You can be like Jesus on the cross, being faithful to the commitment that you've made, even if your spouse is not faithful anymore. And there's beautiful holiness in that. There can be.
Heroism even.
Yeah.
I remember, it's so heroic to see a spouse who, maybe their spouse abandoned them and they're staying true to the vow they made because they take that promise so seriously, which I admire the heck out of.
Yeah, me too.
Not an easy path. And I know everything we're talking about, Anthony's so countercultural, so unpopular, such a punch in the gut. It's my goodness, this is so difficult. But I think, there's obviously a reason, going back, like you said, to what Jesus said. So in the case of that young woman, I think the answer, it sounds like it would be, you gave such a good answer. The church has kind of checks in place to make sure that people aren't doing it for the wrong reason. Is that kind of the gist of it?
I don't know. It's more of a hope that people would do this for the right reasons. But the reality is the majority of people who come approaching the church for a declaration of nullity are doing so because they are either remarried and want to get remarried in the church, or they have a marriage planned. I don't want to criticize anyone for why they approach the tribunal. I'm trying to suggest that there's the best way to approach the tribunal, which is in the spirit of discernment, of trying to discern how best to move forward in my life and what God might be calling me to.
Makes a lot of sense. I want to go back to something that we talked about before, which is a really difficult topic, a hard question to answer, so forgive me. But we have this idea of abuse that we talk about in our culture, and we throw that word around a lot. And what I've seen, in cases of physical or sexual abuse, typically it's like very clear cut. That's what I've observed. And walking with young adults, for example, who maybe had that in their past when they were at home. When it comes to things like emotional or verbal abuse, it definitely seems to get a little bit trickier. And I've seen kind of two camps. One camp who calls everything abuse. Even any sort of bad behavior counts as abuse, it seems. And then the other end of the spectrum, which is another camp, which is kind of unwilling to call anything abuse. And obviously, I think neither are helpful. And so where's that line in the middle? And kind of what does the church do to decipher these cases of like maybe emotional, verbal, or even like mental abuse?
Yeah, certainly it calls for discernment. Many times the church is really relying on the person. The church isn't going to send out a priest to your house to investigate like what's going on in terms of abuse. It's relying on your self-reporting and your self evaluation of that. Is this just my husband mouthing off and not treating me kindly? Or is this abuse that I need to separate myself from? Yeah, it can be very difficult to kind of discern where you're at there. Because I would say if it is truly abuse, you're a human being with dignity, and you're not expected to just put up with abuse, right? So you can legitimately separate yourself. You don't have to put up with abuse. At the same time, I think your point is well taken, that we can't be overly sensitive in calling just anything abuse, any unkind words or anything, because living together, that you're going to rub up against each other. You're going to irritate one another. There's going to be short tempers. There's going to be maybe words spoken in anger, right? And this is just normal stuff. I would say that's not abuse. This is just normal daily living. But if it is constant, if it's berating, if it is really having an effect on you spiritually, emotionally, right? If it's leading to depression, if it's leading to thoughts of self-harm, things like that, that's a different category in my book.
Yeah, totally. And I remember a Catholic psychologist explaining to me there's this idea, like you said, of a personal threshold too, which is where it's a little difficult to kind of draw a line in the sand. It's like, this is abuse and this is not abuse when it comes to like the emotional, verbal, mental. So definitely tricky, but that makes sense. And that needs to be taken into consideration and account. But yeah, it's a topic I've struggled to kind of wrap my head around. And it makes sense that it's a little elusive because it might differ a bit in every situation. But I agree with you. And I think to be clear to everyone listening, it's like bad behavior needs to be corrected. Boundaries are necessary for a relationship to be healthy, especially when it's a case of, ongoing severe abuse. Like it needs to be, sometimes, like you said, a separation might be necessary for the protection of the spouse. And so, so I hope no one's hearing us wrong and saying like, oh yeah, just put up with it and deal with it. Like that's not what we're saying. But at the same time, we need to be careful that we don't call, everything abuse. Because I think in one way it does actually a great disservice to people who actually fully are being abused. Mm-hmm. So it's a big topic I'm sure we could get into deeper. But I do want to maybe go back to the process a little bit further. So I'm just curious, up to this point, we've talked about submitting the petition. We've talked about kind of the church going through, reviewing that. And then, what kind of lead us to the finish line, if you would, of how that all works?
Yeah. So there's some important people in the tribunal we need to talk about. And the first is called the defender of the bond. This is a position within the tribunal where whoever fills that position, whoever is named as defender of the bond, their duty and role is to bring forward anything that can be said for the marriage, that this was in fact a valid marriage. If you think of this in terms of like a court situation, typically you have two different desks, right? You have the prosecutor and the defense attorney, right? This isn't a perfect analogy, but if you think of the defender of the bond as sitting at one of those desks, and it's not the desk that you're sitting at if you're the one asking for the annulments, right? You're sitting at one of the desks trying to argue with your advocate that what appeared to be a marriage really wasn't a marriage. And then the opposite argument is coming from the defender of the bond, that in fact this was a valid marriage, for X, Y, and Z. So these are the two arguments that are proposed. It's the defender of the bond is arguing for the validity of the marriage, and then the party with their advocate is arguing for the invalidity of the marriage. And then it goes before the judges. So in marriage cases, there have to be 3 judges. There always has to be a priest involved, and then there can be 2 lay judges. So in the Archdiocese of Denver, it's Father Giovanni Capucci as the judicial vicar, and then we have myself, and then 2 other lay judges. So on any given case, 3 of us, always the priest, and then 2 lay people will be on that case to resolve the dispute. And the dispute is, was this a valid marriage or not? So we listen to what the defender of the bond has to say, we listen to what the party and their advocate has to say, and then we have to evaluate all the evidence. And the tribunal has to come to moral certitude. Now, moral certitude is not absolute certitude, not like scientific certitude, but it's very similar to what you would have in a courtroom, like beyond a reasonable doubt. So we kind of need to get to that level of beyond a reasonable doubt, that we are sure beyond a reasonable doubt that this marriage was invalid. I said that there's 3 judges, so it's a vote at the end of the day. As long as 2 judges agree, then that holds sway. And so if the 2 or 3 judges determine that the marriage was invalid, then we proclaim that in a decree or a sentence that really lays out the logic and the reasoning and everything behind why we're declaring the marriage invalid. Or, on the other hand, if we can't declare the marriage invalid, if there's insufficient evidence, whatever the case may be, then we again issue a decision, but it's a negative decision. It'll again outline all of the different reasons why the tribunal can't declare the marriage invalid. And then we notify the parties, and then if anyone's unhappy with that, they can appeal. So there's an appellate level. Any tribunal in the country has an appellate court that they can go to.
And does that immediately go to Rome, or is there something?
Rome is one of the options, but it's not necessary. So in Denver, if we declare a marriage invalid in Denver, but then say the other spouse is unhappy with that, they can appeal to Philadelphia or to Rome. There's 2 options there. There's a whole levels of appeal thing. It starts at the trial level, and then there's an appellate level, and then there's an appeal of the appeal. If you ever go to that 3rd level, it has to be Rome. That 2nd level can be Rome, but doesn't have to be.
Makes sense. A few kind of questions about numbers. I'm curious, Denver maybe in particular, or the rest of the country, whatever you think, what's the average number of annulments that maybe are started in a year?
So that's a difficult thing to answer, because there's so many different types of annulments. What I've been talking about is what we call the formal case, or the ordinary contentious process. But many people have what we call a lack of form. And so the idea here is if you're a Catholic, if you were either baptized Catholic or received into the Catholic Church in a formal way, then you are bound by canon law. And canon law says that when you get married, you have to get married before a priest or a deacon, essentially. And if you don't do that, then the church doesn't consider your marriage valid at all. That's what we call a lack of form annulment. So if you were baptized Catholic and you ran off and you got married civilly, however, then the church really just doesn't see your marriage as valid at all. There's a lot of Catholics who fall into this category, and so this is called a lack of form. In Denver, I don't really have the numbers off the top of my head, but I think we do 150 to 200 lack of forms every year. Similar, dioceses that are similar size would probably be similar in numbers. And then formal cases, we do upwards of 200 formal cases a year. And then there's all kinds of other things also that we do, and other types of cases. But so if I had to just rough estimate in Denver, I would say probably upwards of 500 annulments a year given. That's lack of form, that's documentary cases, that's the ordinary contentious process. And then we can talk about other dissolution cases that are not annulments. It's kind of a different category.
Okay, yeah. So, okay, that makes sense. So not dozens, but hundreds, but not thousands. So somewhere in that category. Yeah. Okay, that makes a lot of sense. And how long, for a young person maybe who's learning about this whole annulment thing for the first time, they're probably wondering, how long will mom and dad be going through this? Because I know on the civil side, I know typically what I see is, it could be months or maybe a year. That's typical for a divorce. 2 years seems to be long. 3 years is kind of insane. And so so that's kind of what we see on the civil side, but I'm curious on the church tribunal side. Not that an annulment is a divorce, but the closest thing I can compare their experience to.
Exactly. It depends. If you're looking at a lack of form annulment, we're talking weeks. If you're talking about the full ordinary contentious process, I would say at least a year. Canon law says it should be about a year in first instance, that's at the trial level. And then if it does get appealed, it should be about another 6 months there. So that's a year and a half if it gets appealed. To be honest, that's a little optimistic in my opinion these days. Cases, just because of the volume and the lack of workers in the tribunal and whatnot, it seems like the ordinary contentious process is taking a year to a year and a half on its own. And then if you appeal that, I mean, it can be a mess. I've seen cases that are just a train wreck where it takes maybe a year and a half the first time around, and then it gets appealed to the appellate court, and it takes another maybe year there, and then it gets appealed again to Rome, and in Rome it could take 3 or 4 or 5 years. So, I mean, this can get really drug out for years and years and years, which is extremely unfortunate and not an ideal situation.
Yeah, no, I'd agree with that. But okay, that's fascinating. And so thank you for laying everything out so clearly. You're such a good communicator. I'm curious, there's so many myths. We've tackled maybe some of them so far when it comes to annulments, but I'm curious, what are some of maybe the most popular misconceptions or myths about annulments?
I would say there's 2 that come up all the time. And one is, if I'm Catholic and I get a divorce, then I'm excommunicated. So let's talk about that. That's really not the case. If you are a Catholic and you get a divorce, you're not automatically excommunicated. There is this pervading idea, though, that if you're divorced, you're not, I don't know. Some people feel marginalized when they're Catholic and then they get a divorce. And that's, in my opinion, that's unfortunate that continues to be a part of Catholic culture. I don't know what that is, but no, that's a myth. If you're Catholic and you get a divorce, you're not automatically excommunicated. What could lead to you not being able to receive communion. That's not the same as excommunication, but you could find yourself in a position where you're not able to receive communion, but that's because you've chosen to get remarried, right? So if you're Catholic and you get divorced and then you get remarried, now you're in an objectively sinful situation, and you would need to resolve that before you can come to communion. So some people kind of think of that as excommunication, although technically speaking, it's not excommunication.
For countless teens and young adults, their parents' divorce is actually the most traumatic thing that they've experienced, but so many feel lost and alone in navigating the challenges. I've been there myself. It's really not easy, and it shouldn't be this way. My book, It's Not Your Fault, guides them through those challenges by helping them put their pain into words and begin to heal, work through the emotional problems that they face, cope in healthy ways instead of falling into bad habits, improve their relationship with their parents, navigate the holidays and other life events, and build healthy relationships, and so much more. One Amazon review said this book is packed full of really practical help. If you come from a broken family, or even if you don't, but you love someone that does, this book is so helpful. I can't recommend this enough. By the way, it's a quick read, and it doesn't need to be read cover to cover. Since it's in question and answer format, you can just read one of the questions and one of the answers. And so if you want to join the thousands of people who've gotten a copy, just go to restoredministry.com/books to get the book, or download the free chapters. Again, that's restoredministry.com/books, or just click the link in the show notes.
So that's one of the big myths, that if you're a Catholic and you get divorced, you're excommunicated. The other big one is if you get an annulment, your children become illegitimate. And again, that's just a big myth. It's very clear in canon law that if you were born of a valid or even a putative marriage, a marriage where we weren't sure, we thought it was a valid marriage, but then we looked later after the fact and we determined it was in fact invalid from the very beginning. That's what a putative marriage is. So if you're born to a putative marriage, you're legitimate in canon law. Okay. You could be illegitimate if your parents just weren't married at all and got married, or just had you outside of marriage. Then according to canon law, you would be illegitimate. Now, that doesn't really have any bearing anymore. It used to. In the 1917 code, there was an impediment to holy orders. If you were an illegitimate child, that was an impediment to holy orders. So you couldn't become a priest, let's say, if you were an illegitimate child. But that was under the 1917 code, and that has now been changed. So even though you can be illegitimate under canon law, there's really no effects anymore. It doesn't really matter in any practical sense. So people get all worried about, my children will be illegitimate. Well, no, they won't. If it's just a declaration of nullity, that's not going to render your children illegitimate.
That's helpful to hear, especially to the young people listening right now. It's and it says nothing. I remember when we were working on the imprimatur, which for anyone listening, it's like the approval of the church for my book. We talked about this quite a bit, and you were so helpful. Thank you again. And I think I remember you encouraging me, saying it's very important that we emphasize that it has like you said, no practical consequence, but more importantly, it says nothing about the dignity of the person, their value, their worth.
Exactly.
If they have this title of like illegitimacy, which in my opinion, and this is what we ended up communicating through the book, it's like it says way more about your parents than it does about you as a child. What would you add to that, to maybe a young person who's kind of like wrestling with this? Like, I don't want to be illegitimate. That sounds bad.
Yeah, just exactly what you said. Like, it just doesn't really matter much. I mean, I don't know. It does. It speaks more to what your parents were doing at the time that you were conceived than it says anything about you. It says nothing about you. It says nothing about your quality as a human being. It says nothing about your dignity as a human being. It's essentially meaningless.
I agree. No, it's helpful to hear, and it is a scary term though when you hear it. You're like, oh gosh, I'm illegitimate. What the heck? So, okay, that's helpful. And I'm curious. One question that's kind of come up from parents I've talked to, and young people too, is like, I've heard this, and you correct me if this is wrong, that in order to seek an annulment, it's required that you have a civil divorce. Is that true, first of all? And if so, why is that?
Yeah, that's not technically true. In canon law, it says for a tribunal to accept a case, there has to be some assurance that there's no hope of reconciliation. Okay, so the tribunal needs to judge that this isn't just a couple that's having marital difficulties, but that they've gotten to the end of the road and that there's really no hope of restoring a good married life. Okay. And so how do you judge that? As the tribunal, how do we judge that? What we've done, just as a very practical step, is we've said a divorce is that signal to us. That if they've gotten a civil divorce, that means that this relationship is irretrievably broken. Okay. That there's really no hope of reconciliation. If there's no divorce, then I think we have hope, right? If they're just separated and they're maybe trying to work it out, well, let's keep that up. Let's keep trying to work it out. Let's keep going to marriage counseling. Let's keep doing the work we need to do to see if we can bring this back together and affect some sort of a reconciliation here. So we use a civil divorce just as a very practical measuring stick. If you've gotten a divorce, then for the tribunal, we say that there's no hope of reconciliation. If there hasn't been that divorce yet, then we're always hopeful, and we will encourage them to do that, to reconcile.
Okay, I see. So it's not a requirement per se, but you need some sort of measuring stick to say there's no hope.
Yep.
Which is a tricky, man, what a conundrum, because like we believe deeply in hope. Like we believe in redemption. Like I've heard so many stories of marriages that were in like horrible cases and horrible situations and over a lot of time. Like I think that's the important thing to emphasize. It's like this did not happen overnight. They found a lot of help and healing, and they were able to slowly rebuild and bring the marriage and the family back together. But in some cases there was abuse, there was infidelity, there were like long periods of separation. And then over time, through God's grace especially, they were able to come back together, which is so beautiful. Yeah. So, man, what a tricky thing to do is say like, oh, that's at the end of the road. Whereas, no, we believe we're very hopeful people.
Yep. And I've even seen a case where they got divorced and then they got their annulment. And then years later, they got back together and got remarried. So,
wow. Okay. Yeah, who knows? Yeah, but it's beautiful. And I think there's something, obviously, looking again through the lens of the children, like we're talking here, there can be deep wounds through that whole process itself. Yeah. But there is something, I think, beautiful that you can take away when that happens, that, wow, even though there were hard times, like my mom and dad endured and they were able to make it work. Not that that's applicable in every situation, because I know personally now there's families I'm walking with who are truly in situations where it would be bad. It would be dangerous and not good for mom and dad to be together, unfortunately. Yep. And so anyway, so I know it runs the gamut, but that's helpful there.
We got to bring the kids into this equation too. Sometimes mom and dad's relationship is so toxic to the children that it's not fair for the children to be living in this environment.
Yeah, no, totally. And I think that's where the secular research is really interesting, and I've talked about this a lot in the show, so I won't go into it a ton, but the quick version is that like in cases of high conflict, there is like a very, like children seem to do better when there is some sort of protection via a separation. Again, as that protective measure. And as a church, we would always say the goal is to heal the marriage, bring the family back together. Yep. And I think, you and I'm sure would agree on this. Like we've been too infiltrated, maybe that's the wrong word. We've been too influenced is a better word, by the culture to think that there's no hope. And yeah, even when there's maybe struggles, like maybe it's better just throw the towel in, where it's like, no, this is, and absent extreme cases, marriage has a lot of ups and downs. Like I've experienced some of them myself, and it's like, no, you need to be prepared for those hard times and love each other through them and get the help that you need. So yeah, it's a tough thing to hold in balance, isn't it?
Right. And going back to your earlier question about is a divorce necessary, if we didn't hold that standard and we just said anyone who has any questions about their marriage, they can come and submit a case to us, that would not be good, because you would have these marriages where people are struggling and maybe they're thinking in their minds, is this even a valid marriage? Like, maybe it's not a valid marriage. If there's an immediate path to the church to get that resolved, what I'm saying is that's maybe not what they need. They need to not have that path available right now. They need to be forced to really try to reconcile without resolving the question of was this a valid marriage or not.
I agree, especially in the cases where there's children involved, like we've been talking. And hopefully even without that would still be true. But especially, at least from my perspective, it just does so much harm and damage to the children. So yeah, and high conflict situations do harm to the children, and low conflict situations where mom and dad just decide to part because whatever the reason they might give, that they do so much damage to the children. So one question on that note of like the divorce. So was there a change in canon law or the church in America in particular after the introduction of no-fault divorce? And to anyone listening who doesn't know what that means, in the past there was, I think it was in California, it was passed in 1969 or around 70, this idea of like no-fault divorce where you didn't have to prove wrongdoing, and you have to correct me if I'm wrong here at all, in order to get a divorce. Yeah. There needed to be some sort of proof of like adultery or abuse or addiction or some sort of misbehavior in order to get a divorce. The introduction of no-fault divorce, which ironically happened under Ronald Reagan in California, eventually overtook the entire country. Every state adopted it, and now we're in a state where either spouse, no matter the reason, can file for a divorce. And so I'm curious. Feel free to correct any of that if it's wrong. And then second thing is, did the church change anything in America, at least, after the introduction of no-fault divorce? Because it would make sense based on what you're saying that, that's actually a pretty good measuring stick to like let them hopefully heal the marriage. And if there's truly no recourse, then the civil court has a way to kind of vet that. And then we can maybe trust that a little bit more. So I'm just curious if anything changed after no-fault divorce became more popular. If you come from a divorced or broken family, or maybe you know someone who does, we offer more resources than just this podcast. Those resources include things like a book, free video courses, speaking engagements, a free assessment, online community, and much more. All of our resources are designed to help you heal from the trauma that you've endured and build virtue so you can break that cycle and build a better life. And so if you want to view those resources for yourself or someone that you know, just go to restoredministry.com/resources or click on the link in the show notes.
There's a long, complicated history here. I mean, it starts back in the Roman Empire when there was essentially no-fault divorce in the Roman Empire. You didn't have to have any cause or reason for divorce. So that's what the church was initially kind of born into, is that sort of no-fault divorce environment. But then because of historical circumstances, divorce became very rare and regulated by the church. Separations, the church did separations for a very long time where, if you're having troubles, if you're in an abusive situation and you feel like you need to separate, you wouldn't have gone to the civil courts, you would have come to the church. And the church would have worked out the terms of that separation. The church would never call it a divorce because it's not what the church is doing. It's not dissolving that bond of marriage. It's simply separating the parties for a while. Hopefully they can work it out, right? So for a while the church was kind of doing that. And there became some tension between the civil society and the church. And whose jurisdiction is marriage, right? This was historically a big question. And the church declared very firmly that marriage is the church's area, right? Civil courts get out of it, like marriage is our territory. That was the church's position, for a very long time, but the civil courts have fought back, and the civil courts have taken over some jurisdiction on marriage and divorce themselves. And so there was a bit of a fight. And so this was late 1800s in the United States. There was a plenary council of Baltimore. You may have heard of like the Baltimore Catechism. Have you ever? Yeah. The Baltimore Catechism came out of this Council of Baltimore, where back in the 1800s, late 1800s, all the bishops in the U.S. gathered for this council. And, they did several things, one of which was produce the Baltimore Catechism. Another thing that they did is they made some legislation for marriage. And they said if you're a Catholic and you get divorced and then you get remarried, you're excommunicated. So this is kind of where this idea comes from, and it's still present today, of if you're Catholic and you get divorced, you're excommunicated. But it was connected to divorce and remarriage, then there was an excommunication. Catholics who simply went and approached the civil courts for divorce, they made that a crime and said that the bishop can impose penalties. So the idea was, in the late 1800s in the U.S., the Catholic Church was trying to get Catholics to come to the church rather than to the civil courts for a divorce. But unfortunately, they didn't have much success in that realm. And I think bishops learned that they didn't really like adjudicating these separation cases. And over time, they were happy to let the civil courts do that. There's some practical reasons for that. The Catholic Church doesn't have an enforcement mechanism, right? If you're married to an abusive alcoholic guy who keeps coming around and abusing you and the children, the Catholic Church could make a decree maybe and say you're not allowed to come to the house. But how would she enforce that, right? Whereas if you go to the civil court and they give a restraining order, now this has teeth, and you can now call the police, so there's an enforcement mechanism. If you're trying to separate finances, the church could decree how that should be done, but the church has no authority to do anything, whereas the civil courts do. The civil courts can make orders that, banks have to follow and whatnot, and separation of assets. So the civil authorities have, teeth in a way that the church doesn't. And so even today, if a Catholic wanted to come to the church for a separation, I think most bishops would say no, because it's sort of meaningless. Like, go to the civil courts. They're set up for this. They can effectuate a separation with legal effects that has teeth to it, right? An enforcement mechanism. If the church were to do a separation, we would have to instruct them to go to the civil courts and then reproduce all of this, so that it could have civil effects. And so because of that, just over time, the church has kind of gotten out of that business of doing separation cases.
Okay, on that note, and thanks for explaining all that. So it sounds like, so maybe let me go back. So it sounds like the introduction of no-fault divorce didn't really change much in the church in America. Is that right?
It probably accelerated the trend that was already happening of Catholics approaching the civil authorities for divorce.
Okay, got it. Okay, but it's not like any updates are made to canon law or anything like that.
No.
Okay, got it. Okay, no, that makes sense. You brought up this idea of like the church overseeing a separation. I somewhat recently heard of this idea of canonical separation, and I really haven't heard anyone talk about it much at all. What is a canonical separation, and like how does that work? Briefly, I know it's probably a big topic we can get into.
Yeah, it's basically just what I was talking about, where parties who can't live together for whatever reason would come to the church, to the bishop, for a separation, rather than going to the civil courts for a divorce or a separation. Again, bishops, in my opinion, don't really like doing this, and I think they see that it needs to be reproduced by the civil courts if it's going to have any effect. So even though it's still on the books, you can still apply for an ecclesiastical separation.
That's what it's called, okay.
Yeah. But in my experience, most bishops will just simply direct people to the civil courts.
Okay. I heard of it in a case where it was like, from what I remember, a very devout Catholic family, and they were really struggling to figure out what to do given the struggles within the marriage. And they, saw both paths ahead of them as like continuing to work through things or get a divorce as like not great options. And they heard of this option, and so they pursued that. And so I think that was, a little bit of backstory, because they wanted the wisdom of the church to help them know whether they should pursue this any further or not. So is there some sort of guidance you can get through that process, or is that pretty much the bishop will say kind of hands off?
It depends on the individual bishop, I would say. But I would argue that there is a legitimate space for ecclesiastical separations. Maybe a case like you were just describing, where it's more the couple maybe wants to submit to the church to discern, are there causes for separation? Because the church doesn't have a no-fault separation system. You have to find fault. There has to either be adultery or abuse or unhealthy living circumstances for spouses or children, or something like that. Whereas the civil courts, they don't really care. As long as one person's asking for it, they'll give the separation or the divorce. So I could imagine a situation where faithful Catholics want to submit their will to the church in discernment of, are there even reasons for separation here?
Yeah. So it'll depend on the bishop. That's good to know. Thank you for clarifying that. Toward the end of our time, I had a few final questions. So one, there's been some people, again, oftentimes these are like young people who may be in their 20s or 30s who are like devout Catholics, and they just have maybe some concerns about what their parents are going through, who have conveyed to me that there's concern about like the annulment process overall in America. And without going too deep into this, that's not the purpose of this podcast. Apparently there's been maybe insiders at various tribunals, not Denver, to be clear, who have said that maybe certain dioceses in America have like 100% approval rating for like annulments, where they'll kind of find a way to rush it through. So obviously it's a huge topic to get into. I'm curious, like, what's your take on this? Like, is this happening? And if you can't say, that's okay, but I'm curious.
I think it happens in some places. I don't know how common it is, but certainly there's that impression that in the United States, there are many tribunals that make it very easy to get a declaration of nullity. I guess I would contextualize this within kind of the framework that we've been talking about, going all the way back to Jesus and his comments about, Moses allowed divorce for the hardness of your hearts, or because of the hardness of your hearts. And I sometimes wonder, do we grant so many annulments in the church because of the hardness of people's hearts? Is this some way a concession for human sinfulness? Yeah, and I don't know. But the annulment process is not just ministry to, say, divorced people, people who have been divorced. This is a ministry of truth. And we need to keep that in our focus, I think. Jesus says the truth will set you free. There's freedom in the truth, right? So you submit yourself to the church, to her judgment, for that true judgment, not just because this is what I want, give it to me. But there's great value in seeking the truth and being open then to either way. It might not end in my favor. It might be contrary to what I want, but it's true, or it's more true, right?
Well, that makes a lot of sense. And that seems to be, like you said before, too, the right attitude. And I think I've heard some say that there's been too much of a trend, at least in America, toward looking at annulments as, like you said, anything but a seeking of the truth, where it's maybe seen as some sort of like therapeutic healing modality almost, where that's not really what it was intended. Right. It maybe can have that effect at the end of the process, but that's not the primary purpose, and that's not something that we should really be propagating.
I've heard so many people say, go through the annulment process because it's healing, right? And I don't want to discount anyone's experience. Some people really do have experiences of healing and growth and understanding through the annulment process. Yeah. But other people just don't. It's kind of like the divorce again. And they don't maybe find healing. They find a judicial process that's maybe kind of cold and informal. And, at the end of the day, they get this judicial decision. And so some people walk away, this wasn't healing at all. This was just like a legal process in the church. If I'm looking for healing, I don't go to the judge. I go to a therapist, right? So a lot of different feedback and opinions on what this process is like.
Yeah, no, and that makes sense. And I could totally see like how, knowing people who've been through this, there could be this healing aspect. So I don't want to discount that, especially if there's some sort of like closure. Either way, especially like I've known of cases where, maybe it was denied, like the declaration of nullity. So it's like, nope, your marriage is valid. And then at least like it can be healing in the aspect, like you said before, where it's like, okay, I have clarity of how I need to live my life now.
Right.
So I could totally see that. But I think, therapizing it in the sense of like, once you get your annulment like approved, you get the declaration of nullity, then you can move on and heal. And, that's, I think, a false dichotomy. So
yeah, I would prefer to flip that. You go through a divorce, that's traumatic. Like, you need to go through some healing there. You may need some therapy, some counseling. You may just need some time to heal yourself, to heal your heart, whatever. Go through that healing process first. And then, if you feel that God is calling you to a new marriage, then start looking at the annulment process. I think we get it so backwards sometimes. We come out of this messy divorce, this traumatic and painful, and instead of really looking for healing, you look to another relationship to soothe that or whatever. And then it's from that relationship into marriage, and then, we never ask the question about healing. We need to.
No, absolutely. That's so good. Well, gosh, I could talk with you forever. And I know we didn't even get into kind of what makes a marriage valid. Maybe can you give us the quick version of that before we hop off here? I know
Sure.
that not
Yeah.
necessarily a quick answer, and then we can maybe let people know where they can go to learn more, because there's obviously way more if people are interested where they can.
Yeah, exactly. High overview. There's impediments. There's a whole bunch of legal impediments. So if you're impeded, then your marriage would be invalid. Most people, though, there's not impediments that they're worried about. The other big category is consent. So defects of consent. This runs a whole gamut from like psychological issues through what you intended for marriage, if you like excluded children, or you excluded fidelity, or you excluded indissolubility. These would all be issues with consent, to issues of freedom. If you got pregnant and then your dad gets the shotgun out and says you have to get married, that's a defect of freedom. So there's a big gamut there.
Okay, so basically the three kind of high-level reasons are lack of form, like you covered before.
Yeah. Lack of form, impediments, and then defects of consent, which is a broad spectrum.
Yeah, okay, there's a lot there. Okay, sounds good. And I think what we'll do is the chapter in my book that covers this gives a good overview of those kind of more detailed questions if you guys want to learn more about that. So we'll make that available. You guys can read that for free. So click the link in the show notes if you want to get that, and they'll again walk you through what makes a marriage invalid and what makes it valid if you guys want more info on that. So Anthony, any final comments on that before we a couple final quick questions? Maybe about the question being any other resources you would recommend if people want to learn more.
A good resource that I've found for kind of an overview of annulments is called When is Marriage Null? This is by Paolo Bianchi. I think you can find it on Amazon. I found that to be a very helpful resource.
Okay, we'll link to that in the show notes. And would you say that would be helpful for the children too, or is it more geared towards the parents?
More geared towards someone looking for the annulment.
Got it. Yeah. Whereas my chapter might be more geared to if you're a young person and you're kind of wondering like what your parents are going through and what this might look like, that might be a good option. So that's good. We have one for both. Yeah, I guess let's just close it down now. Thank you so much for being here. I've learned a lot, and I am going to have to re-listen to this too, because it's just, there's so much density to it, and you're such an expert. So I appreciate how well you communicated, and these are not easy things to talk about too. And I want to iterate again to any parents listening up to this point that, we obviously both have a heart for suffering, for people going through difficult times. And, I think you can do that, have that heart, have that love, while also holding to the truth that we see as, coming straight from God. So
yeah,
definitely a big deal. So yeah, I guess, thank you. And I want to give you the final word, Anthony. So what final encouragement or advice would you offer to everyone listening, maybe especially to that young person who, maybe is a little bit jarred or confused, feeling like maybe they're going through a second divorce with mom or dad doing this annulment process?
Well, Joey, thank you so much for having me on. It's really been a pleasure, and I love talking about these things. My final advice would be cling to Christ, cling to Jesus. He knows very well suffering. And so when we suffer in our own lives, we just need to cling to Jesus to find that comfort, even in the suffering of a divorce, right? Jesus is the one who really knows what it's like to commit yourself to someone, to the human race, and then to have them absolutely turn their back on you. So I think Jesus is our companion in this journey.
That wraps up this episode. If this podcast has helped you, feel free to subscribe and rate or review the show. You'll avoid missing future episodes and help us reach more people. And in closing, always remember, you are not doomed to repeat your family's dysfunction. You can break that cycle and build a better life, and we are here to help. And keep in mind the words of C.S. Lewis, who said, you can't go back and change the beginning, but you can start where you are and change the ending.